So now we come to the panel discussion phase of this evening. So if I can ask Parash and SHERIN to join me up on stage. And yeah, whilst they're coming up, this really has stemmed from, I don't know, perhaps a show of hands, who has seen or heard of the paper We Have No Moat, talking about, okay, a few hands. Yeah, so this was mentioned at the FINOS conference, for those of you who are at the FINOS conference at JP Morgan a few weeks ago. And what it's basically been saying is that open source models are rapidly evolving to the point where commercial software is, it's a different sort of conundrum, really, where you have like the community essentially trying to run this technology on their own machines at home. And that's created some interesting side effects. People have done really crazy things like try to run it on really, really small amounts of hardware. But one of the cool things, I think, from a sustainability perspective is they have reduced the amount of compute that's required to retrain or to fine-tune models. But it's also interesting how they have slimmed these things down. They've optimized them such that most people with a gaming PC at home can actually run their own models. And this has really kind of caught the imagination, I think, of the tech industry at large. The Google engineer in that paper was talking about how game-changing it is that the open source community is doing quite so much innovation. OpenAI is fantastic. We've talked a lot this evening about some of the things we're doing with OpenAI, but I do find it quite ironic that an organization that was set up to be an open source AI organization has all of a sudden flipped and decided it's going to be largely a commercial entity. And so I think that's creating a space for others to kind of look at alternative approaches. And so yeah, before we kind of carry on, I'd love to get the speakers to introduce themselves, and we'll get into the heart of this. So I know there's going to be some different views on proprietary and open source models, given we have Prash here from Microsoft and SHERIN representing AI ethics. But yeah, Prash, if you'd start perhaps by introducing yourself.
So, hi everyone, Prash BHANDARI, work at Microsoft. Have worked within our FSI sector as commercial lead for data and AI. So the last I guess 6 months have been wonderful for us. Really interesting conversations with customers, interesting the challenges that are coming down the line from open source providers. I'd like to maybe challenge people's perception in the audience of Microsoft being wholly proprietary, and be good to kind of get into that. Sure. I think we've learned our lesson from the past, but yeah, wonderful to talk today. Thanks for the invite.
And SHERIN.
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm SHERIN Matthew, I'm the CEO and founder of AI Tech UK. So before I talk about what I do, a bit of background about what I did. So I used to be ex-Microsoft partner and ex-IBM GBS AI lead. Used to make commercial, large data AI platforms for Fortune 500 companies. Then I decided, you know what, there's a way to do this ethically, and I decided to start my own company. So for the last 3-4 years, we've been researching massively on democratizing how we can apply AI recipe strategically and democratize this recipe for SMEs. And one of the spin-outs of our research was Smart Ethics, which the original name was Open Ethics. So the reason we built that was, how do we make ethics easy and accessible and practical? So we made a 2-minute version of a full ethics operation management solution, and a 20 minutes and a 2-hour version as well. Yeah, so I'm really excited to see how I can add value today.
Brilliant, thank you. And so I guess the first question I have for the pair of you is, are we effectively seeing the latest sort of technology kind of battle? Like we've seen Mac versus PC, we've seen Windows Server versus Linux, we've seen Android versus Apple iOS. Is that, Prash, is that sort of, do you think this is going to be the next sort of major technology platform, the arms race that essentially the tech companies want to win?
I think it's useful to define it through the lens of an economist. So, if you think about microeconomics and you think about the theory of perfect competition, so the theory of perfect competition is very much going to speak to your point around the low cost of hardware with open source models. Theory of perfect competition states that if there's a perceived opportunity to make a profit in the market, so you get lots of players that kind of come into the market, they erode the profits, and then what happens is at the end of that, you get the leaders, the people that actually deliver value that's useful to the consumers, the public, the organizations that want to go and use and embed them. So yes, it's a new a situation where there's lots of companies competing. They're going to be winners, they're going to be losers. But I think that the theory is, to your point, that people can come with open source technology and they can try their hand and try and compete with the likes of, say, Microsoft or Google and Amazon. But the reality is, from a Microsoft perspective, we're already onboarding third-party open source platforms into our platform. And like I say, we've changed our approach to the market from being wholly proprietary in the past to actually embracing the best technology that's out there that is relevant to the market.
And that was fascinating for me to see, actually, that when Meta talked about Llama 2, they announced it in partnership with yourselves to a degree, and that Microsoft, you can go on Azure and you can have a Llama 2 hosted, my understanding of the press release anyway, correct me if I'm wrong. And so it's interesting to sort of see Microsoft perhaps hedging its bets somewhat. I mean, clearly you've got a very strong relationship with OpenAI, all this stuff going into Copilot, all that. Ourselves, Scott Logic, are very actively looking at Copilots for all of our people. But then you also potentially have organisations that perhaps want to run their own models because they have perhaps concerns about proprietary models and
so I wouldn't refer to it as hedging our bets. And I'll go back to our arch competitor in AWS and the great presentation that was provided a moment ago around MLOps. But the point is, the big technology companies absolutely recognise that whilst we have key components that we will deliver to the market, we're open enough to embrace other capabilities, other tools, and don't lock out other parties, because actually that's what people like you demand. Yeah. We don't have the best of everything. We do the best that we can, but we're not the best at everything. And the fact that other tools exist in the market, if we're open to that, then everyone can win.
And SHERIN, what's your sort of take on the medium-term impact of sort of the open source AI models that we're seeing? Do you think this is kind of the game-changing moment that paper sort of outlined, or do you see, effectively, what do you see kind of in the medium term in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing we got to realize is AI is software 2.0, right? It behaves and trusting.
So of course, Siri has to join the conversation there.
See, there's AI everywhere.
It's listening all the time.
And I think this is exactly the point, right? AI has become not just an intelligent and enticing software, it has become quite invasive and also quite intimate piece of software. And when we make this quite open, there are consequences. So I'd like to kind of, just for the argument's sake, take a different angle. Open source is open source software the digital empowerment. However, when we say open source AI, we're talking open intelligence. Now imagine if intelligence is easily, openly accessible to all. What happens if you could just write an exam and everyone's intelligent? If everyone is intelligent in this room, why would you write the exam? Everyone is smart. When everyone is smart, no one is smart. And other thing is, with open intelligence, open source was designed with good intention and community value. We can't guarantee that with open intelligence. Will there be good intention and good outcome as a product of that? So I think we kind of got some danger there in terms of adopting that. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who often says, there's no speed limit on Mars. All right? That means we're actually racing without realizing what's ahead of us. There's no regulation. And we are talking about opening intelligence. Now, there's a fascinating example of open intelligence, which is we all know how to drive, right? So driving is an open intelligence. We get licensed to drive. We go to driving school, go to DVLA, pass, we get a license. There are taxi drivers who have license to drive taxis. This is open intelligence. Now, there's a company, which I don't want to name, that's pioneering the driverless AI model. Now, if you're paying subscription for your own intelligence that you have given and trained, and later on it becomes the ultimate model that kind of commands the whole driving scenario going forward, that could be a potential risk. This means there could be a potential intellectual colonization as a side effect. So again, I'm talking a bit futuristic here, but we got to think of the unintended consequences and unintended users in the scenario as well.
No, I think you're right to kind of look further ahead. I think I see a lot of people very excited by the short-term possibilities of this technology, not thinking a few steps ahead. And one of the discussions I've had on podcasts recently is thinking that through, like thinking through how does this impact your value chain? How does it impact your operating model, and how things will, so what does this look like in 2-3 years' time? Equally, people are perhaps overhyping some of this as well. Like I was reading something the other day that said, I think it was Nick Clegg, who's now at Meta, saying this stuff's actually pretty dumb right now, and people are getting quite excitable about stuff that's, yes, it's a step forward, it's impressive, but it's not as intelligent as people are sort of trying to claim it is. So there's an interesting sort of journey we're on, this sort of PR machine, I guess, at the moment, in terms of what is this stuff capable of doing. I mean, what kind of conversations are you having, Prash, with customers around kind of how ambitious they're being with the sort of technology, or is it a kind of wait and see, and a bit like cloud was, I suppose, for financial services a decade ago? They were watching each other to see who would go first. Is there a similar sort of thing happening, do you think, in this space, in this regard?
So there's a few things in there. So I think the first point about the wait and see if someone else goes first, certainly from a financial services perspective, organisations aren't behaving like bunker mentality. They're not waiting for first soldiers to go over, they're all going over. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is that they see it as an opportunity for differentiation. But equally, the other side of it is that financial services businesses, they hold PII data. The risk of them getting something wrong in terms of a response to a customer will have significant reputational damage to their business, and the very thing they're going after, more customers or more customer value, they can very quickly kind of get the quite.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Yeah.
So what we're seeing at Microsoft certainly is we're seeing financial services customers driving very much towards it, but what they're doing which I personally agree with in a very cute way, is releasing the capabilities to the internal communities. So I can give you an example. So one of the capital markets customers that we work with is using document summarization against our internal Confluent for their own IT teams to be able to find projects that they're working on and details within projects. Now, what better than to get the IT team to validate the groundedness of the responses that you're getting? And if that's safe, then maybe we release it to the HR community before we then start going externally to
sort of step-by-step experimentation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So I think financial services organisations are cautious, but they absolutely recognise that that this is an opportunity to differentiate in a market that is becoming crowded with fintechs, etc., trying to steal the market share.
I'm glad you kind of brought us on to sort of the risk side of this, because that's very much the other side. We've started, talked about sort of the opportunity here and how transformative this can be, but the risks are important, and come back to that sort of medium-term sort of time frame. The reputation risks are a really interesting one, but also regulatory. I mean, like the video I played earlier, very much to your point, like you want to go and perhaps upsell, give customers a personalised service that they can't have access to at the moment because it's not possible perhaps to offer that level of service to every customer. But at the same time, you don't want to trip yourself up by recommending the wrong product or saying something stupid. It's going to create reputation damage and potentially regulatory issues as well. But I mean, SHERIN, what's your sort of take on how organisations navigate the kind of risk and reward sort of aspects of this sort of technology?
To keep it simple, there's 3 key factors that you can actually look into when you're especially looking into generative AI, for example. It's not the technology that's wrong. It's sometimes it's our intention, the assessment of the risk, and most importantly is the authority. Now, let's use ChatGPT, for example. Some universities have banned it. Why? Because students don't have the intellectual authority to use that as a technology. So the scope and the use case does matter a lot. What is your intention? Do you have the authority to use it? None of us, I'm assuming, are expert lawyer. So if you go to ChatGPT and say, write me a contract, do I have the authority to do that? And if so, do I have the visibility of the risk that it could cause? So it's really looking at authority, then looking at the risk, and lastly, the intention. Intention plays an interesting role because generative AI could be used as a tool
Yeah.
This is where the intention comes into play. AI is amazing. I kind of love AI, but it's ultimately how it's used as a tool. Creative industries potentially could be impacted. So we need to also think about who has the license to ultimately use the final product. The scope matters a lot. For example, the Scott bot that you made, the scope is Scott Logic Company.
Yep.
For your internal usage. Perfect use case, right? However, going back to the wild camping example, it's like everyone's got tent. Does that mean we should do wild camping? Right? Same thing with guns, right? And guns there, it could be used in both the ways. Similarly, generative AI could be used positively with right intention. So it's really just factoring authority, risk, and intention.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what you talked about, the kind of understanding the domain which you're asking questions in, I think is becoming increasingly important. I think Declan already made reference earlier to the lawyer that got ChatGPT to generate something, and it included some case law examples that didn't exist, which got them in a lot of trouble. And I think where I am at the moment in the sort of short term is this is very much augmenting people that understand the domain that they're asking the questions of it in. And I think this is where the kind of consumer-facing aspects of some of these solutions we're talking about, putting this in hands of customers, is quite interesting. Like how do you sort of manage the kind of understanding of what this thing is generating and putting in their hands. So they're kind of going back to sort of experimentation to sort of manage this rollout. Are you also sort of Parish sort of talking to the regulatory sort of? Have you heard any kind of noises from that side? I mean, clearly the EU is taking quite a hardline stance on some of this technology, but I'm wondering in the UK whether you've had any kind of discussions about what the regulator is likely to do, particularly in financial services around AI.
So it's a great point. Last week, 26th of July, Google, Microsoft, the OpenAI Foundation, and Anthropic, I think, launched the Frontier Model Foundation.
Okay.
And the purpose of that Frontier Model Foundation was to create aspects of safety in terms of the use of very much some of the things you've been talking about, to look at kind of best practices, but specifically to engage with academia and with governmental organisations across the planet. Brad Smith, our Chief Legal Counsel, has specifically gone to market saying we advocate for having a regulatory regime. Now, we know that the laissez-faire approach to regulation led to what happened in 2008 within the banking system, and we know that you can't trust organisations to be good citizens, left to right, top to bottom. And I'd say that Microsoft has radically changed since the impacts of the Fed investigating us and the European Union investigating us in the late 90s and early 2000s. So we have a very strong culture around do things right. So within Microsoft, we refer to FATE, fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics when we're talking about the use of artificial intelligence. But that alone shouldn't mean that we should be trusted. You need a regulatory regime. You do need there to be rules in place. It's just how are those rules written? And I think that's partly why the Frontier model has been created, because we've seen it. When you see things like Mark Zuckerberg in panels in the States, interviewed by politicians, the reality is these things have got to a layer of complexity where actually some of the politicians don't actually understand the questions that they're asking to inform them how to kind of develop and drive the appropriate legislation. So I actually think it's incumbent upon us to speak to regulatory regimes and try and deliver some level of education.
Okay. I'm going to kind of move us on to the sort of more conclusions, if we can conclude. We're just scratching the surface here, really, aren't we? But I'm keen to go give the audience time to ask questions of you as well. So before we do sort of flip over to sort of audience questions, open source AI models, whether that's generative, whether that's kind of generating text or images or what have you, clearly some people have described this as very empowering. Other people have described this a bit like giving the blueprints to nuclear weapons and publishing them on the internet. Where, I'll allow each of you to answer this, where are each of you on open source AI models, whether this is a positive development, and perhaps any words of caution around how we should be proceeding as an open source community with AI models?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'm going to give you first. I'm giving you some really tricky questions here, sorry.
No, good question.
All good fun.
Yeah, it's all part of fun. what we got right now is narrow AI, right? And even narrow AI in proprietary software format, it's absolutely powerful. So when you make something narrow, accessible openly, thinking long term, when models talk to models and model can connect with models, this will result into something very close to AGI, right? So now imagine if someone has open AGI, thanks to various open narrow AI.
Are you, sorry to jump in, but are you effectively saying sort of a mixture of experts or a mixture of models type philosophy is going to give us something akin to...
Yeah, I think just letting them talk to each other, connect with each other, and integrating them with each other could result into the next AGI. And then, if we continue with that philosophy, AGI connecting to AGIs can result into a very solid, strong, say, chat capability with solid, very human parity level emotion capability to philosophy capability or anything. Just imagine all that connecting together. That is getting close to almost sentient level. So there's an element of risk by allowing open AI or open intelligence rather, just go rogue. But I think we probably need to think about the whole management side of things first as well. So I think my answer is, should we go open or should we go close? I'm saying we probably need a bit of both because people need to know the transparency of what's been built, right? The model needs to be explainable, transparent. That's necessary. So there is an element of openness needed, even for proprietary models. But if you go too open, there's an element of risk of not being managing that. So I think I probably would love to sit somewhere in the middle where we need to bring best of both because there is some element of risk involved in just going rogue.
Look, I'm a strong Microsoft advocate. I believe we do both. I think we do both at the same time. I think I recognise, the comments around hallucinations. We've put in place a strong, responsible AI ethics framework around what we do, but we also bring in tools around prompt engineering, the ability to actually test the completions, to see whether they're valid, whether you want to release them into your kind of core applications. We do some of that stuff. One thing I encourage everyone in the room to do, either tonight or in a minute, is recognise that there's actually a difference between ChatGPT and what's offered by Bing Chat. So Bing Chat, under the hood, is ChatGPT, but it's the Microsoft version of it. So ask it a question. Ask it to give you a joke about David Cameron or Boris Johnson, a politician, essentially. When we released it in January 1, if you asked for a joke about David Cameron, it would have given you a joke. We soon recognised that it's inappropriate behaviour to deliver jokes about politicians. If you go into ChatGPT, ask for a joke about Nicola Sturgeon or whoever, you'll get a joke about her. If you go onto Bing Chat, you won't get one. It's because we recognise there's some things the model just shouldn't do. That's a very minute example of what's right and wrong. And once again, we talked about the regulatory frameworks. This is what we think about what's right and wrong. There may be other things that we haven't even thought about, haven't even consumed, that actually we should be thinking about. So we can't answer for all of it, right?
And you raise a really important point there because we've been using a number of the sort of Microsoft AI technologies. And one of the things, if I was talking to one of your colleagues, Uli Human, quite senior on your AI sort of side of things, he was giving a talk to an American audience that I was dialed into. And he said that the kind of Azure OpenAI services are clearly quite different from just something where you casually sign up as an individual. And I think that a lot of people perhaps aren't aware of the difference there, that there's, I suppose there's the models as they are almost in a freemium mode where potentially you're giving some of your IP and some of your information into sort of training those and retraining those models. And then there are the models deployed perhaps within Azure and other cloud providers that are more business friendly in terms of the controls and things that are put around them. But because that's the interesting thing for me is so if I kind of tackle this one quickly is the degree to which you might better mitigate IP concerns. I know there are a number of organisations that are worried, particularly in the creative space, kind of book authors and so on, are concerned about their content just being hoovered up by these things. And so actually, they're a bit like there are some organisations in retail that aren't too happy about putting their compute on a company that happens to run one of the largest e-commerce platforms in the world. I think you're going to get a similar situation with certain industries that go, I'm not going to hand over my IP and the keys to my castle, essentially, to a large sort of AI company because it's only a few steps down the road that they then have a whole load of my data and effectively my value. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about you've got to understand where does this thing go in the sort of medium to longer term. It may be a novelty now, quite fun, potentially a productivity enabler. But if you're allowing people to use these tools, these knowledge workers to do their day-to-day jobs using these tools, eventually you'll get other models potentially trained on that activity that's going on top. And there's things like diffusion models and so on that learn sort of human behavior patterns. I think we need to go into this with our eyes open. I think the open source stuff's fantastic. Like I said, I've been running some of it on my machine at home, and it's very interesting to see how it behaves, and it behaves very differently from Bing, very differently from Bard, very differently from ChatGPT, depending on how you've got it set up. But it's kind of going into this with our eyes open, and where does this lead us? Is the sort of thing I would like to sort of impart with people. But anyway, we've been sort of rabbiting on quite a bit at you. We've got a few minutes that we can take questions. So let's go corner over there. Hand up over there in the corner.
Hello.
Someone got a mic. Sorry.
I've got a mic. I've got a question.
Oh, okay. Go on. Whoever.
Okay, so I'm interested in the panel's opinion on what actually they think open source AI is in an era where Llama 2 has been mischaracterized as open source, where we've got OSI and Linux Foundation currently busy working away at trying to figure out what it is. What does the panel think?
I recognise that voice because I think that was something you posted on my LinkedIn post the other day. So so yes, I think it's interesting to sort of reframe that. There's been a bit of debate as to the extent which Llama 2 released by Meta really is open source, or is it just parts of the model have been, or the overall solution has been made available. Debatable, I suppose. What's
not open source. By OSI definition, OSI come out said it's not open source.
yeah, probably more open than others, arguably.
That's why. What does it mean?
Yeah, I know. So, fair point. I'll hand over to the others. What's your take?
I have a short answer.
Yeah, go on.
I have a short answer. I don't know the answer to that, but what I would say is, why does it matter? If it's a tool and it delivers an output that you want, that's valuable to what you do, who cares whether it's open source or not?
I'm guessing the sort of transparency is perhaps a key. I mean, Sherin.
Yeah, it's really like going back to the basics of how open source is made. It's made by multiple contributors with a community intention. However, with the current LLMs, it looks like a tornado's gone and just consumed various data out there, and it's almost vomiting out the result. That's kind of like a negative definition. I think this is where the question comes from. Mm-hmm. There's that little phobia of what open source intelligence or AI actually means. In my opinion, it would mean like various experts coming together, various companies coming together and really being dead transparent about, I'm using X element of this, I'm going to use X element of that, and really coming together as a consortium. That, I think, in my opinion, is being more open, where they're sharing the parameters, the accuracies, the data that they've used, and transparency at scale, and by everyone. So when you put these type of models together, that gives a better, authentic result. Right now, we're kind of going with one company or one entity that's built everything all in one. So I think that is where the question comes from my opinion. But I think to solve that is really all the players coming together collaboratively.
And it is interesting, isn't it, that we had in OpenAI originally an open source AI organization, and then that's gone somewhat closed. And now we have Meta claiming to be doing open source models. Maybe we will eventually get another iteration of this where the training data, the full toolkit to build this thing from scratch is, because I agree with the question at the back, this isn't fully open source. But I think there is a concern in the tech community that giving everything away is a little bit like giving away like too much. And secondly, you start to get into all kinds of challenges around fair use of the source material that it's used to train on and various other things like that. And it's going to be fascinating to see if we do get something that OSI does agree is truly open source, has the whole sort of the full piece. So yeah, an interesting one. Yep.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Matthew. I find it actually quite disconcerting what Mr. Bhandari just admitted publicly, that Microsoft is already limiting what their open source AI will say or not. So what is your opinion from an ethical perspective to go out and promote something as open source and artificial intelligence where it's been admitted what is actually being manipulated to what's shown or what's not shown behind the answers?
Are you sort of referring to its independence in terms of how independent it will respond?
Yes.
Okay.
Objectively, that's an interesting question. And I don't know where to start.
I'd like to respond after you've...
Yeah. If you want to start, go for it.
Look, we embed within our model something called the content safety framework. Within the content safety framework, we moderate what's being asked in terms of what the prompts are. So, for example, if there's anything that involves hate, violence, sexual misconduct, we won't provide an answer for it, irrespective of who's using it, what organisation. I believe that's a good thing. I think that's kind of right for humanity. I think, look, these models, they create kind of moral hazards. And that's, that's a position that we've taken. Now, I appreciate you may think that our model should deliver a joke about a politician. We don't think it should. We don't think that's a good thing. I actually think the restrictions that we place are limited, but I think the ones that we put in there are right.
Yeah, going back to the question, unfortunately, because the way some of these deep learning LLM models are designed, openness and transparency especially is really challenging. We can't say which line has come from where, which sentence, paragraph has come from where, because the way it's been trained. I think the true openness will be if we could say, I said this and I've learned this from X person or from this website. And I think that's where I think there would be a bit more trust and an element of openness. Right now, I think it's almost black box tech, I would say, where we're really struggling to get that explainability out, which I totally understand. That leads into this trust question that probably everyone has in this room, is how can I trust AI? And if it has learned something, where has it learned from? And lastly, if it has learned from my website where I published paper, worked hard for it for 3+ years, how can I say, wait a minute, I got copyrights on it, can you please unlearn? Technology is not there to unlearn at this stage. And I think that's where I think your question is coming from. But if it was me designing an open source AI, I would probably expose those elements of transparency and probably that lineage where we can see where, and I think that it's ethical value chain, where it comes from, how it's been built, operationalized, deployed, and in the end, telling your users with that honesty and transparency and trust that this is what I'm doing. I think that probably will take a bit of time. But I think the intentions are there from what I hear.
I think the other challenge to this is you can put in the prompt to these tools, give me references or give me citations. And the problem is there's nothing stopping the model hallucinating those, and it does. Some are better than others. Because it's a bit like asking a person, so they tell you something, right, where did you learn that? How many of us can precisely go back to the textbook or the website or the Wikipedia page where we learn that? And we have to start moving, I think, into a model where we're not treating all this technology like the technology we had for the last 20 years. This tech operates differently. Sorry, I don't know who's difficult to see with the lights. Who's next? So.
Can you hear me? What do you guys think of Falcon 40B?
Sorry, say again?
What do you guys think of Falcon 40B?
I've not had a chance to play with it myself yet. So for those who don't know in the room, it's again another open source. Perhaps we need some air quotes when we're saying this sentence now. That was launched by the UAE, I believe, or one of the Arab states have released it. It's a 40 billion parameter model. It's come out sort of around sort of same time as the original Llama. I think you can use it for commercial purposes. Yeah, you're nodding, so that's right. And I think Llama 2 has also said the same. So I've not had a chance to play with it myself directly. I don't know if either of you two have got a view on Falcon.
I know Falcon's been onboarded into our Azure OpenAI Studio, as has Llama 2. I don't have any experience of it, so can't speak any further.
Probably one for a networking discussion. Perhaps show of hands, who has used Falcon? Okay, so a couple of hands, 3 people.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to start, let's just do a quick straw poll quickly. Who's used ChatGPT? Has anyone got, so who hasn't? So let's turn it around, who hasn't? Okay, all right, okay.
Oh, wow.
Bard? Who's used Bard? And Claude? Okay, yeah, so there's some other ones to go and check out if you haven't already. Claude 2 came out fairly recently, has got a massive token size. So yeah, you can take a big document in, explain it, very interesting. I'm getting told I need to wrap it up, so thank you, Claire, at the back. Thank you very much to the pair of you. I've thrown some tricky questions your way, so thank you. And yeah, we've got networking and refreshments out back. We are on a fairly strict sort of timetable. I think we need to be out of here by 9. The plan is to find, and there's a place, is it the Nest? Yeah. Over the road for those who are staying on after the 9 o'clock sort of deadline here. But once again, thank you to NatWest for hosting us. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the networking and the refreshments afterwards. Thank you.